And I think this is happening, in terms of the strikes, because we can talk about a little bit about, Joe Biden going to visit the UAW strike. But and I don't know if it's just a generational thing or what, but they don't understand whether these are strike, like I feel like we saw this with the studios on the writer's strike. I feel like we see it with the UAW strike. And I feel like we see it with like what Pelosi did, is that they don't understand that social media now, one of the functions that it serves is to push back on stuff that is small like that, and change the understanding of at least the most engaged people, which sometimes are the most problematic for stuff like that.
Right. Yes.
Right. I mean, do you have that sense?
Yes. Yeah. And that's why people say, when people say Twitter is not real life, they don't understand that so much of our understanding of how things are unfolding develops there. And then among the most hardcore people, like people watching this show, for instance, if you're watching this show, you care, you care a lot about politics. You probably in your friend group and in your family, somebody that people come to and ask questions. So government really going to shut down? And so what social media conveys to those people who are then getting asked in their social circles questions really matters. What we say here on this show matters because we're the source of information for people that are then going to convey it onwards. And it's obviously going to be a game of telephone all the way. So by the time it gets down to the people that are paying the least attention, it's wildly distorted. So the closer you can be to accurate at the top, the better. Because it's going to get lost, in translation anyway.
Let's talk about. There were two, I think, sort of major aspects of Joe Biden going to the UAW picket line. One was that it's just pretty historic. We've never seen a president do that, and it has real, I think, meaning. I mean, I just thought, like, the idea of having Sean Fain having 3 or 4 minutes of unencumbered coverage of his speech on cable news. Like, when was the last time that ever happened?
Never.
If ever. Right. Yeah. And I mean, it was a big deal. And then the amazing thing too was the dogged insistence by the political reporters at major publications, the Times, the Post, the AP, Reuters, that Donald Trump was going to visit union workers and, basically doing the same thing. And he was doing almost the opposite.
Right. It feels like partly the union movement is so small at this point that the idea of a union worker has been drained of its actual meaning, which is somebody who's a part of a union that is fighting for benefits for themselves and their community. And it just means like a person with a lunch pail that shows up to a diner. Like, whether or not they're in a union is kind of beside the point of whether or not they get coded to East Coast or West Coast reporters as like union members. So the fact that he's going to visit people who might have a hard hat somewhere in their vicinity, they're like, oh, that they're probably in a union, that counts. When it's actually no, like lots of them are not in unions. That's the whole point. That's what happened.
Something like 93% of workers are not in unions, right?
Yes, they're not. Yeah, and a significant portion of people with hard hats and lunch pails are not in unions and are making 50%. Look at wages at Tesla compared to Ford, and that's before the strike.
And this is just like political reporters having no clue, isn't it? I mean, this is like they're not labor reporters. I mean, this is one of the things, like I had a conversation with someone who is a producer on a national outlet, in a social setting. And they were lamenting, like, there's not going to be any primaries really this year because there's no real primary race. We're going to talk about the debate this week, but they're like, it's almost like a foregone conclusion who's going to be. And they're like, we don't know how to report on this. I'm like, well, I mean, we have really big labor stories going on. Like the FTC just announced that they're going to go after Amazon. There's a court case against Google. Like, these are major, aside from like the government shutdown, which is also covered like ridiculously. these are major stories, and I don't think I've had a more disinterested look that I have faced when I was talking than since, like, basically, telling my 18-year-old daughter, like, dude, you got to do a little more reading, and like, oh, whatever, Dad. I mean, it was honestly, it was
as if you started to like tell somebody about a dream you had the night before.
Yeah, like, but the most banal,
Yes.
boring dream in the world.
It was
And
Ralph Nader, but it wasn't.
I forgot about, like, just how much the people who write about politics, for the most part in this country, don't really care about, like, what politics are. Like, it's literally like my relationship to sports. Are the Patriots or Red Sox in the playoffs? Okay, I'm going to engage.
Yes.
The Celtics in the playoffs, I'm going to engage. But otherwise, it's like, oh, okay.
Yes, and I think 70 years ago, when these issues were bigger, mainstream reporters had their skills at covering them as kind of the horse race style, because that's what they need. They need to be able to have villains. They need to have good guys. They need to have, who's winning and who's losing, because like getting into the substance of anything is just difficult for the mainstream press. They just want to report like it's sports. Back in the 50s and 40s, 50s, 60s, you could talk about labor fights in that way because everybody was most people knew someone in a union or were in a union. When it came to antitrust, you've got the bells and like these, you had like real live fights that people were engaged in. And I think we've kind of lost that muscle memory, but maybe we can get it back with enough fights. Because like, you're right. Like, there's no primaries. I guess there's nothing to cover. It's like, except like the class war between labor and capital that is like bursting onto the scene in a way that it hasn't in almost anybody's living memory.
Right.
Or like you said, the Department of Justice and the FTC taking on maybe the two most powerful or two of the top 5 most powerful companies in world history, like direct shots at them. Like these could be exciting stories.
There's certainly going to be ones that touch, an enormous amount of people's lives. And it is, I don't know. I hope that changes, but I just had this, like, I had forgotten about that. Like I had forgotten about it because, I've been living in this sort of like mainstream news, bubble of sorts. And,
Right.
I remembered like back, in the aughts when I would go in and fill in for, on MSNBC and remember like thinking like, oh my God, how am I telling these producers about Social Security? How do they not know this?
Yes. It's
Like
amazing.
these are left leaning producers and they don't know. And,
Right.
You walk into CNN's green room and it's like to have even like a remote conversation with a producer there about anything that beyond like that surface thing. And it was just, they'd look at you like you were a lunatic.
Like, are you here to sabotage our show? Like,
Yeah. I mean, honestly, that was what their concern was. Like, I hope you're not going to say this on air. What? But let's talk about that. The UAW. I mean, what do you think the implications are? I mean, for Biden making that trip. I mean, obviously it helps the UAW, but like, is there going to be anything more in this? Like, is this going to, I don't know, impact his reelection in some fashion? It certainly felt like Sean Fain was very appreciative and like went after Trump and made it clear, like, we're paying attention to who's our allies.
yeah. And I think from a horse race perspective, what it does is it really forces Trump to defend his claim that he is the champion of the working class. And I think in 2016, because, Hillary Clinton was, considered to be, the Clintonian, free trade supporting, kind of neoliberal giving speeches at Goldman Sachs candidate. And because of that, it allowed Trump to just say, I'm the tribune of the working class. And as absurd as that was, the Democrats weren't really putting something up to kind of contrast with him, so he could just skate on that. Now, the press did botch it badly on he's going to this, he's going to head out to speak to this, union workers out in Michigan. But you also saw real efforts by the press to kind of correct themselves when they realized that that was wrong. And I think a lot of that did penetrate the public consciousness that, like, oh, Trump is not actually supporting union workers out here. What he's saying is we shouldn't have electric vehicles, and he wants the UAW to endorse him so he can be president. But he doesn't actually support the current demands of the UAW. And so once his very thin kind of support for the working class is pushed on just a little bit, it falls apart. And so I think by Democrats and by Biden, like, doing something demonstrative like that to say, look, I'm actually here, I'm supporting them, and here's how I'm supporting them, it really puts the test to Trump. And it's a test that he can't really pass because all he has is culture stuff.
That's a great point. I remember, I think it was at Youngkin's. I think it was the Youngkin race, and who did he run against? Was it
McAuliffe?
No. Was it McAuliffe?
Yeah, it was McAuliffe. Yeah,
McAuliffe. And the problem that McAuliffe had in going after Youngkin was like a hedge fund guy.
Right. But
the problem that McAuliffe had, like, and people were like, it was like at Bain, I think he was, and if I remember this correctly, is something to that effect. But McAuliffe couldn't go after him because he'd also worked at Bain Capital. Yeah. And so that line of attack was taken off the table. Whereas, Biden's going to have the opportunity, assuming he's the nominee, to use that against Trump.